listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. My co-host today is Michelle Jewel Shaw, award-winning volunteer for Friends of Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouses. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jeremy, and hello to all of our listeners out there.
Today is June 15th, 2022, and this is a special edition of Lighthearted. We're going to hear a conversation I recorded about a very interesting subject, a place called Sailors Snug Harbor on Staten Island in New York City. It's not strictly lighthouse related, although there is some relationship to lighthouse history. Michelle, please help me tell our listeners about Sailors Snug Harbor and our guest.
Sure, Jeremy. Sailors Snug Harbor is a collection of 19th-century buildings on the north shore of Staten Island in New York City. It was founded as a retirement home for sailors using funds bequeathed by Captain Robert Richard Randall when he died in 1801. Sailors Snug Harbor opened in 1833 and expanded over the years to more than 50 buildings. It was said to be the richest charitable institution in the United States, with farms, a dairy, a bakery, a chapel, a hospital, a concert hall, recreation areas, and more.
The Sailors' Home relocated in the 1970s, and the not-for-profit Snug Harbor Cultural Center was formed in 1975 to operate the buildings, and the Staten Island Botanical Gardens managed the gardens. The two organizations merged in 2008 to form Snug Harbor Cultural Center and Botanical Garden. The Cultural Center includes the Staten Island Botanical Garden, the Staten Island Children's Museum, the Staten Island Museum, the Newhouse Center for Contemporary Art, and the Noble Maritime Collection, as well as an art lab and music hall.
Sailors Snug Harbor today consists of 26 buildings, including Temple Row, which consists of 5 interlocking Greek Revival buildings. The grounds also include a chapel and a sailor's cemetery.
Bruce Weir is a descendant of sailors, sea captains, and military veterans with an interest in maritime and military history and genealogy. He's devoted himself to researching the history of Sailors Snug Harbor, and I had a chance to talk to him about it a while back. Let's listen to our conversation now. I'm speaking this afternoon with Bruce Weir, who is a maritime and military history researcher. And I just want to mention that I became acquainted with Bruce when I sent an email related to the website findagrave.com. I was researching for an article I was writing on Sheffield Island Lighthouse in Connecticut. And I found an illustration of Captain Robert Sheffield, for whom the island is named. On Find a Grave, the contact there was Bruce Weir, and he helped me out with information for my article. And that led to a discussion of Sailors Snug Harbor on Staten Island, New York, which we're going to be talking about today. So thank you so much for joining me today, Bruce.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
So first of all, I know you have kind of a personal connection. How did you get interested in Sailors Snug Harbor?
Well, it was really by accident. I was researching my family history. Over the years, you work on your family history off and on. And I was focusing on my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. Her name is Jean Robinson Weir. And she has some interesting lines that go all the way back to early New York City area. She's got some Dutch, French Huguenots, and English that were like settlers of Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow, even New Amsterdam, some of the Dutch that they're connected to, New Rochelle, and actually Hempstead, Long Island. So I was focusing on one of her ancestors. His name was Christian Robinson. And I knew, we had some sailors and that he was a sailor. And I'm going through the, typical censuses and stuff. I see him in Brooklyn. And all of a sudden he disappears around the Civil War time. And now he's older. He came in the 1830s to New York. And so by the time of the Civil War, and he had his kids later, he was like in his 60s or close to 60. And I'm like, where do you go? And all of a sudden I notice he comes up on a census in 1870 and 1880 in this place called Sailors Snug Harbor on Staten Island. So I was like, what's the Snug Harbor place? So I started looking it up and I was shocked. I'm a native New Yorker, and my family's been there for hundreds of years in all different parts. My parents were from Brooklyn. I was born in Queens and grew up on Long Island. I never heard of this place. So I started reading the history. I was fascinated. I just was amazed. I found out they had records that are hosted at the SUNY Maritime College. And for the folks that don't know what SUNY means, it's the State University in New York, Maritime College, which is the oldest maritime college, the first one in the United States, started in the 1870s. They sent me records and I was shocked. It had details on there. It said the town in Denmark he came from. I didn't know that. Now, he came during the Civil War. What I found out from records is he got injured, and that's in the 1860s, and I knew his sons were in the Civil War. When he got injured, there was nobody, could help him. He went into Snug Harbor, and the light went on, and I'm like, wow. And so I read the history. There's 2 books written about Snug Harbor. So when I read those, the history was just amazing. And then I found out they had records for all these guys. And then when after that, like a year or so after that, I decided this is forgotten. Look at how many guys are in this place. It's like 10,000 over 140 years. And I got to do something to honor these guys, tell their stories, try to figure out who's in the cemetery. Do they have records? They do, of all the people that are in there.
Yeah.
And, tell their stories. And that was really what it was about. And I was thinking about the other reason I did it. I mean, it's a huge project, it's going to take a long time. I knew that. And I was still working then.
Sure. So we'll get into some more of the specific details, including more about the cemetery in a couple of minutes. But, and you've already said, kind of answered this to some degree already, but why is Sailors Snug Harbor so historically significant?
What's really interesting about it is it was the first retirement home for sailors, and this is on a large scale. This is a big place. It ended up 50 buildings. It was at the height about 1,000 mariners in around 1900. This is before the Navy had a retirement home. The other thing is how it came about is really amazing. You have this sea captains, the Randalls. It was a father and son. Thomas Randall came from Scotland in, I think, the 1740s to New York. And he was a successful merchant sailor. And then during the French Indian War, he became a privateer. They were merchant sailors that, to augment their navies, they would hire merchant sailors to put guns on their ships and attack primarily the supply ships of their enemy. So he did that. He was successful. Like the name of the ship, he had a couple of ships, but the one privateer was called Fox, which I thought was a cool name. But he caught quite a few French ships. And to get people to do this, they could entice them to do this. They would keep half of whatever they captured. So he became wealthy, and he started like an import-export business. He was prominent in New York business circles. He helped start the Chamber of Commerce. Even before, when we were still a colony, he was interested in helping other people. So sailors and captains would get lost at sea, would die at sea, and their families become destitute. So he started the Marine Society in New York, which still exists today. 1770, got it chartered under King George III. He also was the New York Chamber of Commerce. I think he was on the board of directors of the Bank of New York. He dies in 1797, and then a friend and attorney was Alexander Hamilton. And then the son dies in 1801, and his will started. So I think it was like the first will that was used to create a foundation. So that gets it started. Then there's all these lawsuits against it. Took like 20 years, but it created this board of trustees, which is interesting to keep it going. So it wasn't people getting elected, it was positions. So that trustees still exist today, and they still financially help. So I don't know when the first foundations in the United States were started, but it's one of the first. And it definitely helped a lot of people, including my ancestor.
You've done a lot of research, as you've said, about Snug Harbor, the history of the place, and you've researched the lives of some of the sailors who lived there. I'm wondering, just in general, who were those men? Were many of them military veterans? Were a lot of them merchant sailors, fishermen, or who were they?
Well, to get into Snug Harbor, you had to be a sailor for at least 10 years and then sail under U.S. flag for 5 years. The only other place that was similar to it, and I think they got the idea, was the British had a Royal Navy hospital in Greenwich. That's the only thing you could look at. All these merchant sailors around the world, they all knew about Snug Harbor because they were sailing around the world. When you look, it's amazing what these guys did back then. So they all knew about it. And they had a saying, "I'll see you in Snug Harbor one day." And so even guys there's a lot of people from all these different countries when you're looking back in the records. They're from all the port cities in the United States. So I found some names that'd be of interest, some of the guys I found so far. Robert Sheffield, you mentioned, he was in the Revolutionary War. He survived the prison ships. But then there's a guy that in the War of 1812 named John Strain, who sailed on the USS Saratoga during the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain in 1814. He ended up in Snug Harbor in the 1870s. He was really young when he was on the Saratoga. His descendants have posted stuff on my Facebook page. They have a medallion that was given by Captain Thomas McDonough. And that was a key battle where McDonough, defeated the British there. Captain John Jan Weber was an officer on the USS Monitor during the famous battle with the CSS Virginia, or known as the Merrimack. He was the last officer to die that was connected with the USS Monitor. And you look at the newspapers, so he died in 1909. The newspapers had big articles about him in there. That was one of the things I looked at, is looking at the newspapers. Like Harper's Weekly, every couple of years would write big articles about Snug Harbor. There's a guy named William Cushing, who was the captain of the famous clipper ship Dreadnought. That one set a lot of speed records between Liverpool and New York. And then there's Captain George Nelson Armstrong. Now, his story is pretty amazing. He also was in the Civil War. And then in the 1870s, so he is sailing on a ship called the Templar, September to July 1879. He's sailing from New York to San Francisco around Cape Horn. Well, as they're getting down, coming down the South Atlantic, they hit a storm, get demasted, pull into Brazil to Rio, and the ship starts getting infected with malaria. After they pull out and are leaving, guys start getting sick, the whole crew, he gets sick. Now, in those days, a lot of people didn't realize the captains, if they had a family with young kids, they bring them with them. They're on the ship. And his wife gets sick and dies. Like most of the crew dies. He's sick. He's like delirious. He had a teenage daughter. What's amazing about the story is he had a teenage daughter working with one of the mates, literally sailed the ship around Cape Horn all the way to San Francisco. So the ship, usually it took like 100 plus days to get between New York, sailing all the way around there. This thing came in months late. They thought the ship was gone. When it showed up in San Francisco, the people freaked out. They thought it was a ghost ship. They couldn't believe it because it was going so slow and it took so much time. The insurance companies, of course, were happy. And they gave him like $1,000 worth of gold, and it was a big deal.
You also talked a bit earlier about Alexander Hamilton, but could you just kind of recap maybe a bit about Hamilton's associations with the starting of Sailors Snug Harbor, and then I'd like to get into some of the other notable people in American history who relate to Sailors Snug Harbor in one way or another.
So I'll talk more about Hamilton. I mentioned that he helped the Randalls. He actually drafted the will for Robert Richard Randall when he died in 1801. And in the will, he created this trust, this foundation, to use the Randalls, when their money owned all this property. It was called Minto Farm, which is in the Washington Square area of Greenwich Village. They owned the land north of it, like 20 acres. They bought it in 1790. So by 1801, that's what they're going to use, plus the money from his company. He gave money. He had some sibling. He had one sibling still alive, or two, a sister and a brother. Gave some money to them. Gave some money to his the people that worked for him. And then he gave the rest of it, and they thought to use the farm as the retirement home. So, and it says in there for injured or destitute sailors, or decrepit is the word they used back then. But the language of it had like 8 positions, created this board in perpetuity, which was like unheard of back then. And it had the mayor of New York. And so when the first meetings came about, the trust, DeWitt Clinton is the mayor of New York. And so he's like on the first board of the trustees of Snug Harbor. The idea was these are positions that would go on, whoever was in them would be on this board, which was really smart. You could keep it going. And then he would use the money and resources. Well, there were all these lawsuits. And it was one thing he told the Randalls when they were coming up with this, trying to come up with the idea of what to do with their money and stuff. Because Robert, he didn't have any children. He wasn't married. He was a bachelor. And there's like, I love the quote is kind of like, he told him it came from the sea, you should give it back to the sea. And, if you know Hamilton's history coming from, the Caribbean and all that kind of stuff, it's just like, well, that's really cool. And it just shows you that the founders, Hamilton, he was involved in a lot of other things outside of the government stuff that people don't know. This is one of them. The Randalls, and the mentality was they wanted to help people because sailors, if they got injured or hurt or old, they became destitute and were all over. You see the pretty pictures of New York City harbor with the clipper ships. You don't see the streets a couple of blocks in, and they were just lined with homeless, injured sailors. There was no safety net. And so that these guys that they thought about trying to help people like that just kind of tells you, that everybody wasn't just greed and that kind of thing. It was amazing people in the beginning. Hamilton was one of them, and so were these Randall guys.
Lighthouse buffs know also that Hamilton was the first person in charge of our federal lighthouse system in August 1789 when they passed the act that created the lighthouse establishment. He was the first guy in charge of that. So
it's just amazing. Like the Customs House in New York, he started the whole, revenue cutter service. He started Customs House, they tax the ships coming in and out, use that to fund the government. That was like the major source of income back in the day. When you think about it, it's incredible, but that there were these Randall guys, there were other people like that in a lot of different cities that you don't hear about, did some really good deeds that helped people. And it helped me, myself in college, and my ancestor when he was hurt in the 1800s. They would have been destitute, really until the sons got back and that kind of thing. And he stayed in there. My ancestor stayed in there. I think some of these sailors went in there because they were used to being at sea so long that when they got older, they didn't want to be a burden on their families. So they could leave and come. They could come to Snug Harbor and leave. They had shops in there where they built model ships that they have the Noble Museum. I know you're going to talk about. They have this unbelievable model ship collection that were made by, and some of these are, clipper ships and stuff the guys sailed on. It's just, amazing when you see all that.
Moving along, also, you mentioned Thomas Melville before. Obviously, there's a connection to Herman Melville.
Right. Yeah, Thomas Melville was Herman Melville's youngest brother. And he was a sea captain, and he sailed out in the Pacific all around for a number of years. And then 1867, he got the job to be the governor of Sailors Snug Harbor. Now, at that time, Melville had published Typee and Moby to call that earlier, but this was in the phase in the 1860s where his books weren't selling well. And he came back to, he was originally from Manhattan, New York, and he came back and he became a Customs House inspector. And so he was working there. And then when his brother got the job, and that was a big job. They have like a whole separate mansion for the governor of Snug Harbor. But Melville becomes the governor. And so Herman's going there on holidays. Thomas has got a family. There's photos of him at Snug Harbor. But Melville was innovative, and when he came in, he redid all the records, the application form, the registers. He had all pre-printed forms. Before that, they were just blank sheets like in a notebook, and they just wrote little notes in there. And they had some weird coding system. I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm focused on the old registers from the 1830s to when Melville redid them in 1869. those original registers, figuring out who's on them, and that is just, so I'm trying to build an index. Thomas Melville redid all that, but he was tough. A lot of the sailors didn't like him. Sadly, he died in 1884. I think he had a heart attack and died because he was just in his 50s. Herman Melville was 11 years older than him, but Herman Melville never got over that. He really got depressed after his brother passed away. So 1867 and 1884 is when Thomas Melville's there, and he did some good things, but he was a task, master, and I think he was tough on the employees there too. There was some, you read about some things about them, getting upset with him. So
there's another connection to lighthouses. William H. Wilson is buried at Sailors Snug Harbor. He was married to Ida Lewis, who is probably the most famous, not just the most famous woman lighthouse keeper in American history, but probably the most famous lighthouse keeper at Newport, Rhode Island, Lime Rock. They were married very briefly, and us lighthouse buffs who maybe know a lot about Ida Lewis know virtually nothing about William H. Wilson, her husband for a brief time. What have you learned about William H. Wilson?
Well, I went and got his application form, was in the archives, and had a lot of details about him. He appears that he sailed for like 27 years. He was from Black Rock, that's Connecticut, where he was born. But it looks like he had some relatives that lived in Greenport, Long Island. And I know there's a ferry, it's just like kind of right across the sound. And I can gather he probably bounced. But when he sailed for 27 years, starting in 1859, he first sailed. And the first ship, they would ask on their application, the first and last ships they sailed on, which is always interesting to me. And the first ship he sailed on was the Marianne Notbohm, I believe is how you pronounce it. And that was one of these clipper ships that was going back and forth, kind of like the Dreadnought, back and forth to Liverpool on a regular schedule. So that's the first one he sailed on. And that ship, later in his career, they moved it to San Francisco, and it was sailing from Australia back and forth. So he starts off on like one of these serious clipper ships, and then he transitioned to become a coastal sailor. And in the records there, it mentions that he fell on that first ship. He fell down and got injured on that ship. I can imagine he was just a newbie sailor, and he was probably overwhelmed. Yeah. If you want to know what it was like to be a crew on those ships, dancing around on all those masts, there's a video I'll mention briefly called, for the Peking, was the ship that was at South Street Seaport for a long time. It's an iron hull ship, it's a little later. But in the 1920s, a guy that was on the crew, he was from Massachusetts, filmed going around Cape Horn. It was one of the last full riggers that went Cape Horn. And he's got, I can't believe he held the camera. That thing is going through the, crazy storms. These guys are hanging on the rig. I mean, it's just like how people didn't fall off that stuff and die. I don't know.
Yeah, I know it's pretty common.
So he came into Snug Harbor. He mostly sailed out of Gloucester and New York. So he was doing a lot of coastal stuff out of there, you see. He names various captains. His references are always interesting to me, where these captains were. And some of them were from Port Jefferson, Long Island, which is interesting. He has some from Bridgeport and that. There's always notes in there. And then he sailed coastal for 20 years, 7 years doing bank fishing. So maybe when he was in Gloucester, he was doing that. Then after that, he's working for some iron company. He stopped in 1886. He becomes a captain. At that time, he retires from that, and he worked for some copper company in Bridgeport, which is interesting. And then he did that for a number of years. And then he entered Snug Harbor in 1911. And he noted that he had rheumatism, which is another one of those old, diagnoses that, what's rheumatism, So I always find that one interesting.
Yeah, aches and pains, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, probably had arthritis is probably another name for that, or some kind of nerve disorder thing or something. Sometimes I look at the handwriting because they had a sign on the documents, and you can kind of notice the guy's handwriting is a mess. So he might have had arthritis and some kind of nerve condition or something when you get older. Yep. And he dies in 1925, and he's buried in the cemetery. So Ida Lewis, when they got married in 1870, So he's sailing in 1859, they get married then, and then they separated. But on his application, he noted that they were still married. I think they separated, but they never got legally divorced,
right,
which is interesting. I found him on censuses in the 1880s, living with his relatives in Black Rock.
Mm-hmm.
He's noted on there. Now, these guys, he might have he'd been sailing for months and then come back, for a period of time and then sail out. That I noticed that. And then he doesn't appear until the 1920s, on the 1920 census in Snug Harbor.
Well, it's good to know any details about him at all, because again, Ida Lewis never talked about him after she came back to Newport after being married with him.
That's how it is with a lot of this. It's hard to find sailors because a lot of times they don't appear in censuses. You can't find anything. They had a family, they would list them when they were out sailing. But if they were just on their own, they just in between ships, they were in flop houses, basically, that were down by the docks.
Yeah.
And so they just don't appear. They didn't do like censuses of ships because they were gone for months at a time.
Yeah.
So I find descendants, when they find the memorials on Find a Grave, they're like, when I give them the records, they realize it's the guy. They've been searching him for years. It's one of those brick walls in genealogy, they call it, where they got a person at dead ends, they can't find them. And the detail, that's why I was amazed when I saw the details of these records. I was just thanking Thomas Melville every day I look at him. Yeah. But I'm amazed that, nobody cared about this stuff. They just all office stuff and they just were throwing it out,
Yeah. So let's talk about the buildings and the site there that exists today. I understand many of the buildings at Sailors Snug Harbor are now referred to as the Snug Harbor Cultural Center and Botanical Garden, which includes several museums. If you could maybe describe a little bit about how the buildings are being used today, and I'm interested in your take on that. Do you think it's a good use of the site?
There were originally 50 buildings, and it's a campus, like it was a 150-acre campus. Now it's like 80 acres, mm-hmm. And there's a mixture of architectural styles, which are really neat. The first buildings that you see when you come to Snug Harbor, you see these 5 Greek Revival buildings in the front, and they're known as building A through E. And those have some museums in them, and they have columns, Greek Revival, and the architect was a famous architect. His name was Menard Lefevre, who was the first one that pushed Greek Revival architecture. He wrote guidebooks that were published and used by architects and builders all through the United States he designed them in the 1830s, the first 3 center ones. So it would be, C and B and D. Those were the first ones built in the 1830s and 1840s. And then the other 2, so the A and E, those were built in the 1880s later. The interesting buildings, when you go there, the A has the Staten Island History Museum in it. And you go in there and they've changed the inside of it a lot. It's nice, but it's modern. So it kind of throws you off when you come in there. And they have the history of Staten Island. There's a lot of interesting stuff like the Vanderbilts from Staten Island. B, I don't think it's being used. But C is the center building, and it's got the Greek Revival columns on it. But it has really cool, that was the administrative building. That was like the first building built when they opened it in 1833. And when you go inside there's a hallway. It's like a 2-story, has big vaulted ceilings. It has an osculus dome in it. When you walk in, it opens up to this big, great hall. And it has a staircase that goes up that's wrought iron and has like old wood wing coating on it. That's really cool. But in the ceilings and in the walls, they have nautical, like frescoes painting them. They're just like amazing. And then they have celestial scenes, almost like you're looking at a night sky out on the sea with stars and moon and stuff like that in there. And the lighting is, the way they did it it's amazing. When you go in there, it's kind of startling. And then they also have above, because it's got the high ceilings, above the doors, they have the old transoms, and they have stained glass with maritime scenes in there, pictures of ships, stuff like that look like Tiffany glass to me. Just and they're very large, and they're just amazing. I don't know how they did that. So that's building 6. So I recommend people. It's called the Newhouse Art Center. So it has like modern art inside that building. See, in the 60s, they wanted to sell Snug Harbor and develop it because it's on the waterfront facing New York Bay. It faces the north. And they wanted to put high-rise condos and stuff. And in the 60s in New York City, they started trying to preserve like Grand Central Terminal. That was the first time they started protecting historic buildings in New York City. New York City is just known for tearing things down and rebuilding. There's not a lot of really old architecture. Old there is like late 1800s.
Yeah.
Very few things before that. So this happened at that time. So the New York City started a landmark commission, which would landmark buildings and stop them from being destroyed. They did. The Grand Central Terminal was the first effort. This was like right around that time. And so they landmarked the building, so that stopped them from doing that. And then actually Jackie Kennedy got involved because John Kennedy was a captain in World War II, naval captain. Plus he was into sailing and stuff. The family was. And she came and helped and got New York City. She knew John Lindsay was the mayor, got the city to buy it from Snug Harbor. And then they decided to do a cultural center. So this is just amazing. So you preserve these old buildings that are just awesome. The collection of not just Greek revival, there's Beaux Arts, there's Victorian, there's like all styles over time. It's just, and then that it had a farm, as part of the complex, and they turned into botanical gardens. It's just really nice. It's like a park and a college campus combined into one. So going through the buildings next to the center, building C, Administrative Center building, which is now the Newhouse Art Museum, is the Noble Maritime Museum. And it's named after John Noble, who was a maritime artist in New York City. And he was around at the time while this was happening, was involved in helping preserve Snug Harbor too, along with Jackie Kennedy and other people. That's a really interesting building to go. So that's building D. Mm-hmm. So it's to the left if you're looking at them. And if you go in there, they have a mixture of John Noble's art. Also, they have a Sailors Snug Harbor collection, because Sailors Snug Harbor, especially when Governor Trask was the governor of Snug Harbor, he collected all kinds of maritime art, and they hung them in all the dormitory buildings so all the mariners could see them. Then they had an extensive collection of maritime art. So they have a lot of that in that building. Then they also have a collection of model ships. So people that are into model ships, these are ships that were built a lot of them are built, maybe almost all of them, by the Sailors Snug Harbor mariners themselves. Mm-hmm. And they're all the way from sailing ships, ships they sailed on. So they had workshops in these buildings in the basements, and they could make, so guys did model ships there. They did all kinds of crafts that they knew in these workshops, and some of them built these model ships. So it's amazing to see the ships actually built by the mariners that sailed on them. Behind that, there's annex buildings, so you can see where there were dining rooms and stuff, and they had hallways built between them. So this is way back in 1800s, so because a lot of these guys had fallen, on sailing ships, they had fallen up, been paralyzed. So they were in wheelchairs. So they had hallways interlocking all the buildings together, so they didn't have to go outside in the wintertime. So there's like a subset of buildings behind the main five. Then behind that, they built a music hall that is the second oldest music hall in New York City, behind Carnegie Hall. It was built in the 1890s. I think it seats like 1,000 people. David Bowie did a concert there in the 2000s. That's pretty neat. And then they have a chapel, and then they had a big church that was a miniature version of St. Paul's in London that you see in photographs, but they tore that down in the 1950s. So they had a hard time in the 50s maintaining some of these. And then really what hurt them was during the Depression, the real estate values dropped of all the properties they had. So the income dropped. And then with the onset of Social Security and things like that, they couldn't, there wasn't the demand as far as the number of sailors that needed help that want for Snug Harbor. They would get Social Security or pensions. So it dwindled down. So by the 50s, some of these older buildings, so they had a hospital back going south from the main buildings. They had a big hospital, and they had a tuberculosis sanitarium, which is, if you ever seen them, they're shaped like an X because of airflow. They thought they had all these windows, and they thought airflow would help them because tuberculosis affects your lungs. but they tore those down. So when you go there today, some of those buildings are gone, but they had other maintenance buildings, workshops, and they have a children's museum in one of these bigger buildings that they used for maintenance. And then they have like a art lab in one of the buildings back in there. I think they have like stuff for music. I know a lot of different groups, music groups, use some of their buildings, some of these interior buildings when you go back. And then when you go to I guess it's to the west, there's a road that goes down, it goes north-south, and there's where the governor's mansion was. And then they had these series of interesting Victorian cottages, a whole bunch of them going down this road. And that's where some of the, from looking at it, the people that were like the managers of different departments, the guy that maintained maintenance, like a doctor, and some of the other, financial people, they actually lived. And then they had other buildings they had like a matron's building for the women that worked there. Some of them came from the surrounding areas, but early on, there wasn't a lot around there. So they actually had facility buildings for people to stay that work there. And they had one for the guys, the maintenance guys, and they had the farm was way in the back. So when you look at old pictures I have on my Facebook page, you see a bird's eye view looking at it from, like, say you're in New York Bay, you could see a lot of these buildings and how close it was to the water there. They had their own dock with steep ships. They could go from Manhattan back and forth. They didn't have to go down. And it was a train line that actually doesn't exist today, but actually it was like a little commuter railroad that went down to where the Staten Island Ferry is. But it's pretty close to Staten Island Ferry. If you came across from Manhattan, got on a Staten Ferry, got off, there's a bus you can get on. It's a half dozen stops, goes right along the shoreline, and boom, you see this big campus right there. And then you have Asian Chinese gardens going down. Actually, if you go past those cottages on that side, on that road to the south, that's where all the botanical gardens are over there. So a lot of people you see from the area go there. They from talking to people in the area, they like it. It's like a big park to them. And they like that there's activities there. A lot of kids you see going to like the Children's Museum. It's really a neat place. I was surprised when I grew up in New York City area, didn't know it existed. Yeah. And then the cemetery is further to the south. That was part of the 150 acres, got separated. In the 1920s, they sold off the properties around it. And it's about 2 blocks south of where you see there's a gate that goes all around the campus, and they had little gatehouses you can go in, and those are cool looking buildings also. Yeah. And they had them, so it got chopped up as far as the cemetery, but they kept the main part of it, they contained it. They kept it all together. So the city, New York City Parks Department maintains the parks and everything with it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the Noble Maritime Collection and Museum. I interviewed Megan Beck, the curator there. And of course, they're the steward for Robbins Reef Lighthouse in the harbor. So they're doing a lot of good work. And again, this is something that I've just learned about recently, largely thanks to you. I've been to Staten Island a few times, but I had just very vaguely heard of Sailors Snug Harbor. So this is
it's interesting. I've run into people that grew up on Staten Island, didn't know about it. Because when they built the Verrazano Bridge, it opened up the southern part, and they did a lot of residential development in like the 60s and 70s. So this is all the way in the older northern part. Yeah. And I could see, and there's a highway that goes from the Verrazano across and splits kind of Staten Island, like the northern part. And I could see where people just, didn't get up in there. And it closed, over time, closed in the 70s. So.
Yeah. Speaking of that, that site closed as the Sailors' Home in the 1970s. Right. The trustees of Sailors Snug Harbor still exist.
Yes, and when they closed in the 70s, and in 76 they sold, but they sold actually a couple of transactions. I think it's 72 and 74, but by 76 that's when it closed. They actually moved down to sea level North Carolina. And it was a partnership, I believe, with Duke University. had like a hospital or something down there. So it's on the southern part of the Outer Banks. I vacationed in the Carolinas, so I know, but where's sea level? But it existed for another 30 years, much smaller operation, and it closed in the early 2000s. And in the interim time, between the 70s and the 2000s, the trust sold their properties in Greenwich Village in the Washington Square Park area, which was like 20 acres of like buildings. It's kind of like from Broadway to Fifth Avenue up to 10th Street to Washington Square Park. It was a huge area. They liquidated all those and created an endowment, and that's what they use today to financially help merchant sailors that have financial issues when they're or they get injured and or they get old and they have financial problems. They still help, like I think $300 a year, and they have an office in Manhattan, in the southern part of Manhattan, and it's amazing. So from 1801 to today, so I don't know how many foundations in the United States are that old, but I don't think many. They might be the oldest.
Yeah, it's got to be up there for sure. It's great that they're still doing that good work.
Right.
And you mentioned the cemetery a few minutes ago. I understand the cemetery is actually still under the management of the trustees.
Yes, when they sold the properties to New York City, it didn't include the cemetery. Mm-hmm. And the cemetery was on the southern part of the property. In the 1920s, they sold off the land around it. It's a residential area called Randall Manor. And part of it has a pond that is a city park that's adjacent to it. So it's about 2 blocks south. It's on Prospect Avenue. So when you go down that road with the cottages on, head towards that, you'll pass road, and then Prospect's the next block over. It's to the left, and you'll see this pond, and then you'll see this red brick wall. And if you look to the left, you'll see a gate, and there's some houses actually on that, like right next to the cemetery. And it almost looks like it's part of a driveway for this house, but you see this gate kind of in the backyard area with this red brick wall that goes around, and that's the cemetery. It has no signage on it. It's 8 acres. And there's 6,500 mariners. So of the 10,000 that resided, that from looking at the records, that's kind of what I calculate, probably almost 11,000 between 1833 and 1976. There's 6,500 of them died and are buried in that cemetery, including my ancestor. There's only like 15 headstones in the cemetery. They had some problems with vandalism, so they took some out and they put them in some of the buildings. But there's some notable guys buried in the cemetery. Some I mentioned earlier. Probably the most famous one is an officer in the USS Monitor, Captain John Weber. He was the last officer to die from the USS Monitor. He was at the battle with the Merrimack or the CSS Virginia. He's buried in there. And then there's a lot of, I've been researching the War of 1812 guys. There's all kinds of guys that were in there. John Strain, I mentioned earlier, he was at USS Saratoga. There's a guy named Cornelius Rose I found, who was in the War of 1812 also, but he was also in the Mexican War and the Seminole Wars. And he served on the USS Enterprise. He was actually served under Stephen Decatur and was on the frigate, the President. And then he was also on the USS Constitution. So, all the USS Constitution, the Potomac, all these ships, there's a lot of these guys are in there. So Cornelius Rose, I think he was in like 20-something battles in the records he notices. Another guy, Charles Risby, he was also on the USS Constitution, actually in War of 18, when it fought the HMS Guerriere, which is a famous battle. He was on that ship too. So there's also, what's this interesting about Snug Harbor that I haven't mentioned, was the requirement to get into Snug Harbor. They kept it pretty simple, and you had to sail under U.S. flag for 5 years, and I think you had to be a mariner for 10. There's a lot of the mariners are from all over the world, and they're of all colors and persuasions. And that's interesting. Harper's Weekly used to come to Snug Harbor and wrote articles I found in the 1860s, 1870s, and they would just mention some of these guys' names. And there was a guy named Jacob Morris, who was a black sailor, who at that time was 103 years old. And he actually sailed, he's in a group, the reporter's talking to them, and a lot of these guys all sailed together. But I haven't found anybody older than him. He died a year later. But looking through the records, and if you know about maritime history, they were having a hard time in the age of sail, finding enough people. There was so much commerce going on to fill out the crews. There were a lot of people of color on these ships.
Yep.
And, you know, when you read these old newspaper articles, you could tell these guys really enjoyed sailing together. And at one time or another, they probably all saved each other's lives on the ships, especially the old sail ships. It was crazy in storms. People got washed overboard. You know, if you're climbing those sails, it's insane.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you're in close quarters, people in the military, I played a lot of sports growing up. Growing up in New York City area with all kinds of different people from all different backgrounds. And actually thinking about it, I mentioned my early ancestors, but I am also a product of many immigration groups. I'm a mutt ethnically, all kinds of different groups. And I was to see that there was a place like Snug Harbor that they didn't care what your background was. When you see that in the records, and they actually have some photos from around 1900, you see photos of these guys. It just makes you feel like people did care back in those days, and they got beyond the whole, you know, color and ethnicity thing. And it's just nice to see that and go through these records. I like to read maritime books. It's interesting when new books are coming out. I'll look at them, and the ones I read about the 1800s or even early 1900s, and I look to see if any of these sailors were in Snug Harbor, you know, and sometimes I find them, quite a few. And one book recently, I think came out 2020, by a guy named Skip Finley, was about whaling captains of color from, I think they sailed out of New Bedford back in the 1800s. So he had 50 captains. So I looked through, and I found one of the captains ended up in Snug Harbor, and his name is Severino Pierce. And what's interesting is, you know, in the whaling industry, there were stops all around the world in these islands. Well, there's a significant, in his book, he's focusing on guys from the Azores. Well, I start looking at the burial records of Snug Harbor, and guess what? I find quite a few guys from the Azores in there. So, and then all these other crazy islands in the Pacific, like the Navigator Islands, I learned, it's the Samoan Islands now. Things like that, these obscure islands, and these guys ended up in there. But they welcomed, you know, anybody that sailed that needed help when they got older.
Yeah.
You know, even back to the 1830s, because I think Jacob came. He was in his came in the. I think he came in the 1850s or something like that. So. Mm-hmm. It's just interesting. It's unexpected, you know, and it's a positive thing. Going back to the start, you know, with Hamilton helping the Randall start Snug Harbor. Yeah. It's just, you know, a positive message, even going back to the beginning of the United States, that there was a place that in an innovative way to finance it. I don't know. It'd be something that interesting to see somebody do the similar thing today, you know, where they use real estate income to finance a retirement facility for people. It's interesting idea, even going all the way back.
Yeah, well, it's a great history. It's a great story. And again, back to the cemetery. Yes. I know you've had an idea that maybe there should be some sort of memorial involved with the cemetery.
Yeah, I want to put since there's nothing in there, and it's, you know, over time they used regular headstones, then they used like metal crosses, and then they used just flat stones that there might be some that sunk down to the ground. You can't, you know. So looking at the old maps I found 1940s and 1970s maps of the cemetery, and they show you where the roads, there were paths in the cemetery and where they went. And from the main gate, you go in, and then there was a turning circle, and it kind of forked out different directions with different paths going out from this main kind of circle. And I thought that would be a great place to put a monument to honor all the 6,500 mariners that are buried in the cemetery. And since they were, some were naval, merchant, some were in the revenue cutter service that became the Coast Guard, it'd be cool to have, emblems from those different services on it. Merchant Marine, Naval, and the Coast Guard, and then have something significant in there, kind of like you would see in the Civil War or World War I monuments, like an obelisk type. That's what I'd like to put in there. And then also, I'd like to have a service where descendants, I've found 60 to 70 descendants so far, but I put my Find a Grave memorials out there. Every month I get a couple people contacting me that are usually researching their family and are having a hard time finding sailors, and they see that and they're like, I think this is my ancestor. And then I help them get the records, and then they're so surprised to find out about them. So to honor all these guys, it's sad that they're forgotten. It's a story that's just forgotten at time. A lot of people don't know about it. It's a positive story, and really should do something to honor these guys. So I've tried some things in the past that didn't work out, but now I'm thinking of trying to, the trustees own it, but they're for insurance liability. They don't want to do anything with it. So I'm trying to find a home for it that will allow me access to do something with it, to put a monument, and then have a memorial service around Memorial Day, since a lot of these guys are military veterans. And then also in New York, that's until the pandemic happened, they have Fleet Week is like right around Memorial Day, which is cool because the Navy comes in and does a big thing in New York City. So it'd be cool to have it right around that time, each year. And then, or also do something during Veterans Day, but just open it, just for that, for descendants to come to see, pay respects, because some of them have come and posted on my Facebook page. They could get in there. These guys are from everywhere. So what's interesting is I don't see a lot of people from the New York City area. Their descendants are all over the world. There's folks in Europe. There was a lot of Europe. A lot of these guys are from Europe and the Caribbean, and they're all over the place. And that's where their descendants are, all over the place. Not many in New York City. And I think that's probably why there's not a lot, had been awareness or focus on it in the past, because of that. So my idea is, okay, either I got to create my own organization and have them donate to me, but I don't reside in New York City. I live in Ohio. Be kind of hard. But there is a group in Staten Island that I've talked to that they have old colonial cemeteries and stuff that have been abandoned. So there is a Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries, and I've chatted with them in the past, and I'm trying to reach out to them now. But my thought is to maybe leverage, some of the history with Alexander Hamilton. I know there's societies out there with Alexander Hamilton that might be interested in helping, but I'm trying to, between the descendants and some other groups, maybe raise enough money to maintain the cemetery. So if it got to a nonprofit, they'd have, nonprofits are always, especially like the Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries, they got 11 cemeteries they manage. So it's a lot of money. So to maintain a cemetery, you're going to need some funding. So a way, get some of these groups and try to raise some money, not just to do the monument, to maintain the cemetery, and then give the trustees a way to donate it. They don't have to worry about it, and somebody else gets the responsibility to maintain it and fund it. So that's kind of my idea. And somebody reaching out to some of these groups to help me do it, because it's just a shame. I mean, I have my personal, because my ancestors in there. But just the history of it. Even if I didn't, I'm a history buff, so even if I didn't have a relative in the cemetery, I would be trying to do the same thing.
It seems like a great idea to me. The monument makes a lot of sense to me.
The other thing I want to do is I'm researching the records, so I'm writing biographies short biographies. It's going to take me a long time to go through all these guys. I'm focusing on the cemetery first, and then from the records, guys that were there that were died and buried in other places, or ones that were there and left. But I'm thinking of also, writing some books and maybe do podcasts about these guys as I'm going through researching them to make people aware, tell their stories. It's just getting the stories out.
Yeah, I would encourage you to do all of the above. And you have a Facebook page dedicated to it, right?
Right. It's the Mariners of Sailors Snug Harbor History and Genealogy. I have that. If there's some of these stories are on there, I'm going to put some more of them on. And you see descendants finding that page. Sometimes they find that and start asking questions and realize I have information, about there's records. So you see them posting on there.
But some of the research you've done on the sailors, the thousands of sailors, especially the ones buried in the cemetery at Sailors Snug Harbor, a lot of that's you've entered on findagrave.com, right?
Yeah, the names you see, if you go to the Sailors Snug Harbor Cemetery, so find a graves by cemetery. So you build like cemetery and then you add people to it. So there's 5,600 in there. So I went over the last couple of years, photographed the burial registers up between 1834 is when the first guy was buried there, up to like 1950. And I want to get the rest of them up to 1976 so you can have a complete cemetery. So I got those, and then I started photographing other registers. They had like these giant, they called them inmate registers, is what they referred to back in the day. Instead of, I call them mariner registers, but they were called pensioner registers, were the first early registers were called. And then they called the ones when Thomas Melville revamped them in the 1860s. He created these big volumes, like 1,200 pages, and called them inmates. So I've been photographing some of those because they have interesting details. And then there's they have the applications from the 1860s on that have all kinds of details going forward. And I think what happened was they used them up until 1902 or 3, these big registers that have a lot of summary information from the applications and then notes about what they were doing when they were there. And then looks like they stopped using them, and then they went to a filing system. And but they still use these numbering system from that Melville started with, that looks like they kept through those records. So those applications survived that were in that filing system. It looks like they went to like index cards. I've seen some index cards. So they went to this index card filing system, and then they had stuff actually in folders, and the application survived. So the SUNY Maritime College library has the records, and they're over in the Bronx, all on the other side of New York by the Throgs Neck Bridge. I haven't been there in 2 years, so I'm looking forward to going back, hopefully in the spring. I'm actually, I mentioned to you, looking to do a trip this spring up the East Coast and stopping off from Savannah up to New York City, and going to be stopping in different little seaside towns, port, any of them that have maritime museums and lighthouses.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm going to be stopping at those and not just visiting the museums, but I've reached out to some of them and told them about Snug Harbor and that there's sailors from everywhere. So I'm trying to figure out the ones that came from these areas and then go talk to the folks at the museums, and also invite, if there's historical societies, genealogy societies around there, and talk to them about it, because most of them have never heard of Snug Harbor, don't know anything about it, and realize that they're people from their areas that eventually ended up in there that are interesting. So I'm going to work my way up, eventually I'm going to go to the Mariners Museum in Virginia, which I'm looking forward to seeing the actual USS Monitor, and then working my way up to New York and stopping and doing some research at SUNY Maritime and visiting Snug Harbor in like the May, June timeframe. Yeah. But I'm going to be looking to reach out people. And then I'm going to do in the future another one come up your way, go up to New England, maybe the following year, and stop off and do the same thing. So try to bring some awareness, but also to kind of crowdsource some of the research. it's a lot of work. I'm retired now, but it takes some time, and I like doing things with other people and sharing information. So to me, it'd be fun. I did try to reach out to some colleges. I thought it'd be a great like high school college kind of project. And I didn't get a good reaction from a lot of these colleges. I don't know. American history isn't like cool, I guess, these days. But when I was in college, actually, one of my majors is history. I was an economics major and took history because it was fun and easy for me. So I'm one of those people that can remember all the crazy dates and names.
Well, who knows? Somebody might be listening who's really fascinated by all this and might want to volunteer to help you.
I'm looking, people that are interested in it, and I could, I'm interested in sharing, and somebody wants to help me, that'd be great. But it's fascinating. It's like a glimpse of, you're kind of like doing, it goes back to Revolutionary War time. So it's almost like the economic history of New York City, because when the Erie Canal starts, that's when it explodes and all this trade comes through there to get to the Great Lakes. But so these are the guys, passenger ships, all these vessels, military, whatever, they're the guys that actually were the crews on it. So if you're, most of the history is focused on the famous people. Today, there's so much information out there. You can do the histories of the common average people, and that have connections to famous things or whatever. But it's interesting that you can do that now, where back in the day, it was like almost impossible to do this. But it's still a lot of work, and, not everything has been digitized and all that kind of stuff. So eventually it will be, but in the interim, you need the help. So but it's fun. It's like you're learning different aspects, not just the maritime, but even the history. I like to read social histories of where these guys are from and areas, and looking through newspaper collections. That's where I find a lot, especially the guys in New England. When they died, they would write stuff up about them, and that's where you get a lot of details, these small local newspapers.
Same with lighthouses. That's where I found a lot of my most interesting material. Some great stuff. So Bruce Weir, I want to thank you so much for opening my eyes to this fascinating history. As you said, it relates to so many things. It's a huge subject and absolutely fascinating. And I look forward to visiting that site, which I've never done before, in the Noble Maritime.
Well, you have to let me know when you're going there.
I will.
I might be able to sync up and connect with you. They have the New York City Folk Society, the shanties, like once a month at Snug Harbor in the building that the Noble has. So they advertise it. And I've been there a lot of times. When I go there, I look to see if when they're appearing and schedule around it. And those guys are awesome. It's just amazing when you're inside of buildings like that. And they're playing. Actually, there's a CD a guy researched way back in the 30s, I think, met and recorded a lot of the old shanties from the 8 guys that were still old from the 1800s. So there's recordings of Sailors Snug Harbor shanties. I have a CD around. Can't remember the guy's name, but
I think I've heard some of that. I think
you probably have.
There's a website with some of that, if I remember.
Since shanties became popular, my daughters tease me, Dad.
TikTok. People do
TikTok. It's cool. Shanties are cool now, Dad. Because I'd be singing them, humming them, and playing them, and they'd be looking like, "Oh, Dad, you're just crazy." And now they're like, "Oh, it's cool."
I like to think that maybe there's some spirits of sailors of the past enjoying those sea shanty performances there too.
I bet you, yes.
So again, Bruce Weir, thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I look forward to hearing about more research and progress with everything you're doing, and I recommend that people check out your Facebook page as well. And just thank you so much, Bruce. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Jerm. Thanks for inviting me. And I've learned some new about, the connections with lighthouses. I knew some about them that they were out there. And then when you came along, I was glad that, it's another connection. Every time I turn around, there's some connection to Snug Harbor. It's just amazing.
Many thanks to Bruce Weir for sharing his knowledge and passion for the history of Sailors Snug Harbor. It's really a fascinating piece of American history.
Check out uslhs.org to learn about all the things the U.S. Lighthouse Society has to offer. Remember that donations and memberships help to support this podcast.
The episode of Lighthearted that will be posted this coming Sunday will feature interviews with representatives of two Michigan lighthouses, Craig Wilson of Old Mackinac Point and Karen Hintz of Eagle Harbor.
Pete Goss, a British yachtsman who has sailed more than 250,000 nautical miles, once said, quote, "If you are going to do something, do it now. Tomorrow is too late," end quote. I like that.
I do too. As always, thanks for listening and
keep a good light.